So today we begin our study of religions that originated in the Middle East. Throughout the semester, we've been looking at clusters of religions from different geographic regions. We began the semester in South Asia, and then over the last 2 weeks, we've been in East Asia. And now we're going to move on over to the Middle East, which is the birthplace of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as some other religions as well. And we'll begin with Judaism, following a chronological order. Judaism comes first, then Christianity, then Islam. And we're going to spend 5 classes on Judaism. Today we'll be talking a lot about Jewish religious discourse, returning back to those 4 core components that we find in everything that we define as a religion. So today, after doing some initial sort of historical framework for you, we're going to focus on Jewish religious discourse. That's going to continue on into my lecture on Wednesday. And then we'll begin to explore more Jewish practice and institution of authority and community beginning on Friday and moving into next week as well. So before we dive into Jewish religious discourse today, let's take a quick glance at this religious tradition and get a general sense of what Judaism is all about. Judaism is one of the smallest religions that we'll study this semester. We've already studied a couple of small traditions. Jainism, right, was only 5 to 8 million. And Sikhism was about 25 million, maybe a little bit more than 25 million. So Judaism comes in with about 14 million adherents. So one of the smallest religions that we'll study this semester. And Jewish identity is quite complex in that people can identify as Jewish along religious lines in the sense that they are practitioners of this religion we call Judaism, but people can also identify as Jewish in terms of their ancestry, an ethno-cultural identity. And so they may not actually practice the religion of Judaism while still identifying as Jews. And so that number actually includes both groups. So if we're thinking about the percentage of that 14 million or so that identify as Jewish in religious terms, it might be about half of that. So this is a small religious tradition, but it's a religious tradition of enormous historical significance. Judaism is the precursor, or what we might call the parent religion of Christianity and Islam. And why is that significant? Because Christianity and Islam are the 2 largest religions in the world. About half the population of this planet is either Christian or Muslim. And both of those religions, the foundations for those traditions come to us from Judaism. So despite the fact that this is a small religious tradition, we're going to spend 5 classes talking about Judaism, because as we learn about Judaism and we learn, for example, the stories contained in Jewish sacred texts like the Torah, we're learning about Christianity and Islam in the process. And I think I would make the case that it's really impossible to understand Christianity or Islam without having some understanding of Judaism. So by spending this time studying Judaism, it's helping us to better understand Christianity and Islam when we get to those religious traditions next. So where do we get the name for this religious tradition? We have this familiar suffix, the ism there, that shows up on so many names for religious traditions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and so forth. So if we cancel that out, we can see that the remaining word is Judah. Well, where does Judah come from? Judah is a particular region of the Middle East. It's the site where there was once a kingdom of Judah for several centuries, and its capital city was Jerusalem. And even once that kingdom no longer existed, the region that it was located on came to be known as Judea. And so the English term Judaism is a reference to the religion of the people of Judea, thus Judaism, or Jews as they're called in English. Now, the ancient ancestors of the Jews spoke Hebrew, and in time Hebrew would be eclipsed by other languages like Aramaic, but the earliest Jewish texts were composed in Hebrew, and the name, which we render as Judah in English, in Hebrew is Yehuda, and Jews, again an English term, would be Yehudim in Hebrew. Right? So this is the origin of the term Judaism. Now, Judaism develops in the ancient Middle East, at a time in which there were many different peoples with their own religious traditions. And all of these religious traditions, unlike those that developed in South Asia, like Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth, all the religions of the Middle East had a conception of time as linear, that time is a straight line, that there's a starting point, history unfolds along this line, and then there'll be an end point in some sense as well. So we see that too in Judaism, that there's a clear starting point, history unfolds, you have one life, right? No reincarnation, you have one life, there's no samsara or anything like that. You have one life in this world, and then you die, and then there are other people that live on in other moments of history. And as we look at all the different peoples of the ancient Middle East, take, for example, the ancient Egyptians, or the ancient Mesopotamians, the ancient Assyrians, all of them were polytheistic. They believed in lots of different gods and goddesses. You're probably familiar with different Egyptian gods like Horus and Osiris and Isis and Anubis, and all these different deities in Egypt. Well, one of the distinctive things about the ancient Jews or Israelites, and we'll learn about the Israelites in a moment, is that early on, they were what we would call monolatrous. Monolatrous means that you worship one God. So the ancestors of the Jews seem to have had one God that they were worshiping, and other people were polytheistic. Now, there is some evidence for polytheism existing among some Jews, but the ideal system of worship was monolatry, devotion to this one national deity, a deity who's known by many names, but the most important name, as we'll learn today, is Yahweh. And in time, that monolatry would develop into monotheism. So monotheism isn't just the worship of one God. It's that only one God exists, period. It's not that, hey, we worship our one God, and then those folks over there, they worship their God. That's not monotheism. Monotheism is there's only one God in existence. And so in contrast to the polytheistic peoples of the Middle East, the Jews would come to profess monotheism. And this monotheism would then carry over with some variation into Christianity and Islam. So if that's the basic framework, that time is linear and there's one God, this one God creates time, creates history, and time marches forward, and then time is going to end, what's the problem we're dealing with? Right? When we study the religions of South Asia, the core problem was how to escape samsara. This constant cycle of karmic rebirth is never ending. So we have all these different traditions about how you achieve liberation from samsara. When we moved to East Asia, to China and Japan, we saw that the core problem was about how do you create a harmonious and prosperous society in this world here and now? Well, the East Asian worldview is a little closer to this than the South Asian worldview. Here, the core problem is what we refer to in English as sin. Sin not being just something that is immoral, but something that is done in disobedience to the will of the one God. And that there are all these negative consequences of human beings disobeying God, disobeying his will, his commandments, his instructions. And that as a result of those acts of disobedience, various things occur. For example, the fact that we die. Human mortality is introduced because of an act of disobedience. That various disasters have afflicted different peoples, and in some cases the whole planet, as a result of this disobedience. And so human beings need to be reconciled with God, to become obedient and to follow his instructions. And in the case of the Jewish tradition, there's an emphasis on the unique role that the Jews have in obeying God, that they, apart from all the other peoples of the earth, have this special agreement, this covenant with God, that they have to follow certain rules, obey certain commandments that only apply to them and don't apply to other peoples on the earth. So this idea of obeying God's commandments, his mitzvot, is at the core of the Jewish tradition and trying to prevent disobedience, right, of going astray, of not following God's commands. So last week we studied East Asia. Just to make it clear, because other semesters I've had some students get confused. This is East Asia, China, Japan. This is the Middle East, over in Western Asia. Right? At the beginning of the semester, we studied South Asia or India. So notice the significance of the continent of Asia in the history of religion. And when we think about all the biggest, most important religious traditions in the world, they generally all come from Asia. Right? Christianity, Islam started in Western Asia, Buddhism and Hinduism in South Asia, Confucianism, Taoism in East Asia. Now, certainly there are indigenous religions in all these other parts of the world. And at certain times, those religions were pretty prominent, but they die out. It's really the religions that developed in different parts of the Asian continent that would come to be the dominant religions in the world today. So we're starting now our focus in Western Asia, what's called the Middle East, also called the Near East. And here's a close-up. So I had you find several sites, countries, cities at the beginning of the semester from this region in your map assignment. Here circled, I have the city of Jerusalem, this holy city that is holy to Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others. And Jerusalem had been the capital city of the kingdom of Judah. It's in the region known as Judea. But we've got some other notable places here. We've got Damascus, and we've got Rome over here. We've got Constantinople. We have the Greek islands. Here we have Mecca and Medina. This is the birthplace of Islam, the second largest religion in the world. Over here we have Alexandria in Egypt. So this is the setting for our studies moving forward. What's the earliest reference in recorded history to the ancient Israelites? That is the ancestral precursors to the people we know today as the Jews. Well, it comes in the form of this ancient Egyptian monument called the Stela of Merneptah. Merneptah was the name of an Egyptian pharaoh. A pharaoh was an emperor or king of Egypt. And a stela is essentially a stone monument that contains inscriptions on it. In this case, it's a stela celebrating the great military victories of this pharaoh. And the amazing thing about this stela is that it gives us precise dates. Right, of course, the Egyptian dates have to be converted into our calendar system, but archaeologists, upon discovering this and translating it, thanks to the Rosetta Stone, which allows us to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, were able to identify this stela as dating from the year 1208 BCE. All right, so we have a clear date for this stela. This is all text here. And it's recounting all the achievements of this pharaoh. And it just so happens that in one line, after talking about all the various Middle Eastern peoples that the pharaoh had defeated in battle, we come across this one line that says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. That's all it says about Israel or the Israelites. But that is the earliest reference to the Israelites that we have. And because we're able to date this, we're able to say, okay, the Israelites existed in 1208 BCE. By that point, they definitely existed. How long they existed prior to that, we don't know for certain. But we can say with a good deal of certainty that by 1208, right, we have the Israelites. And oh, by the way, this stela is talking about victories in Canaan. Canaan is the land, that strip of land that we now call Israel and Palestine, the place where Judea is located. So we can situate the Israelites in Canaan, in the Middle East, in 1208 BCE. Now, a great deal of archaeological work has been done in the Middle East. There's still a lot to be done, a lot of sites to further excavate and explore. But ongoing work in Israel and Palestine today has found evidence of the ancient Israelites and has given us a picture about how the Israelites emerged as a distinctive people. The prevailing view among scholars, among archaeologists today, is that the Israelites were in fact a faction of this broader society of ancient Canaan, that the Israelites were themselves Canaanites, that they were a kind of mixture of lower class, lower caste Canaanites who rebelled against an aristocratic, declining Canaanite society and forged a new identity, a new, more egalitarian society apart from all the other peoples of the region at that time. As they separated from the rest of Canaanite society, from the various neighboring peoples, the Israelites crafted a distinctive identity, a sense of self, a sense of nationhood, if you will, by formulating stories about their origins, about the origin of the world, about their national deity, Yahweh. And these stories would exist as oral tradition for some time, perhaps evolving during that period, and then eventually being written down. And we have some evidence that parts of these stories, some of it existing in the form of poetry or song, found their way into writing as early as the 9th century BCE. But it's not until we get to the 6th century and thereafter that these stories, these oral traditions, and the existing written records are brought together to form a cohesive text, a cohesive religious text, which lays out these traditions of the Israelites, who they are, where they came from, the history of their world. And it's this text that we would come to know as the Torah. So the Torah is the foundational text of Judaism, the most sacred text. Here you can see I've got a written copy with me. The Torah consists of 5 books. And in English, we know these books as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you're familiar with the Christian Bible, you recognize these books because these are the first 5 books of the Christian Bible as well. But they're originally Jewish texts. Before Christianity ever existed, these were sacred texts of Judaism. So when we look inside the Torah, the literal meaning of the Hebrew word Torah is teaching, we find an account of the history of the world thus far. That the ancient Israelites, the people who we would come to know as the Yehudim or the Jews, the ancient Israelites wrote down their stories in Hebrew. Initially, they focus on where the world came from. How did humanity begin? Right? A typical creation myth that we've seen in other religious traditions. When we studied Japan last week, we learned the creation myth of the Kojiki and Nihongi, the story of Izanami and Izanagi, the creation of land, the kami, humanity, and so forth. So here we have an Israelite creation myth. And after talking about the origins of the world, the story then shifts to focus on the ancestors of the Israelites themselves, right? This is an Israelite text, so it's not just to be a general text about humanity. It's focused on the story of the Israelites themselves. Now, in modern times, scholars have learned a great deal about the ancient Middle East, not just the Israelites, but other peoples as well. And we can find a number of striking parallels between the stories contained in the Torah and the stories told by other civilizations, many of which far older than the Israelites. Stories from ancient Mesopotamia, stories from ancient Egypt. But again, one of the distinctive things about the Israelite narratives is this emphasis on one God. Yes, initially it's more monolatry, but certainly in time it develops into monotheism. Whereas all the neighboring peoples were polytheistic, belief in multiple gods. And not only does the Torah champion devotion to the one God, but it also condemns idolatry. That is the depiction of the one God through statues. Now, why is that significant? Well, because in the ancient Middle East, the gods were always depicted in physical form, statues. Look at the ruins of ancient Egypt. We have these fantastic carved statues of the different deities. Look at ancient Mesopotamia. Look at ancient Assyria. Look at the ancient Greeks. The gods were depicted typically as in human form. In ancient Egypt, we have animal heads and things like that as well. But the Israelite God, the Torah says, should never be depicted. That this God is transcendent, is beyond. Now, some of the wording in the Torah is a bit more ambiguous. There's descriptions, for example, of the God of the Israelites as walking and having conversations and doing things in a very sort of human sense. But there was still this distinct emphasis on not portraying Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, in the way the Canaanites had depicted their gods, the Egyptians, and others. So for the remainder of the lecture today, I want to talk about some of the stories contained in the Torah. That these stories, these sacred narratives, these myths, are integral not only to our understanding of Judaism, but by extension, Christianity and Islam as well. That these stories are part of those religious traditions as well. So when we look in the first book of the Torah, to in English as Genesis, we have the creation story. Chapter 1, verse 1. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be lights," right? Probably heard that story before. So I just read to you an English translation. Of course, the Hebrew is different. The Torah was written in ancient Hebrew, and so the English word here, God, this is an English term. It never actually appears in the Bible. If you read the word God in there, that's the English translation. That's a Germanic word in origin. But Hebrew is a Semitic language. So what's the term being used for this creator deity? Well, in the opening of the first book of the Torah, the Hebrew word is Elohim. So we could render it as, when Elohim began to create heaven and earth. This Elohim will later on in the narrative be identified with the most sacred name, which is Yahweh. And there was a time when the sacred name for the Israelite God, Yahweh, was mispronounced as Jehovah. But scholars today believe that the word is actually pronounced Yahweh. And you say, well, why is it that there's even a debate about pronunciation? Because the original Hebrew didn't include vowels, just consonants. So the sacred name for the God of the Israelites in the Torah is Yod He Vah He, those four consonants, or those four letters. Let me phrase it that way. So the question is how you vowel it. So for a time, scholars thought, well, you vowel and pronounce it as Jehovah. The vast majority of scholars believe that is incorrect now, that it should pronounce something like Yahweh. So Elohim, this is a general word for God. It's actually a plural. The singular is Eloah, but here it's in a plural form. Creates the world. Creates the sky, the expanse, separates the waters, creates the sun and the moon, all those things. And on the sixth day, this occurs over periods marked as days. On the sixth day, the first human being is created. And the first human being is a man who is created from the earth itself, from the soil. And the Hebrew word for earth is Adama. So this man made from the earth is called Adam. So Adam is derived from the word for earth, the soil, because he's made from the dirt, from the soil. But this word Adam also comes to generally mean man. So once he's created Adam, or Adam, as we pronounce it in English, he places Adam in this pristine garden, the Garden of Eden. And Adam is allowed to eat from the trees and live in this blissful existence where he knows no suffering, no hardship. And he lives in peace with the animals of the garden. But Elohim, or Yahweh, determines that Adam needs a helper, needs a mate alongside him. So he puts Adam to sleep and removes a rib, according to the Torah, removes a rib, and from this rib crafts the first woman. This first woman who Adam would name Hawa, which literally means in Hebrew, living. We know her in English as Eve. In the Hebrew, it's Adam and Hawa. In English, Adam and Eve. So we have then the first two human beings, the first male and female, the parents of the human race. Not just the Israelites, but the whole of the human race. And so they're allowed to live this pristine existence where they don't know death, they don't know suffering, they don't know hardship. But there is a rule they have to follow. Elohim says there's one tree in this garden that you're not allowed to eat from. Do not eat from it. Now, on the surface, that commandment, that instruction seems pretty benign, right? It's like, oh, you can't eat from the tree. But remember that, as I said at the onstart, don't think about sin in terms of morality. Think of it in terms of obedience and disobedience. So eating from that tree when you're not supposed to is a significant act in the story. So among the animals that exist in the garden, there is the serpent or the snake. And the Torah describes the serpent or the snake as the most cunning of all the animals. This is an animal skilled in persuasion. And so the snake talks to Hawa, Eve, and says, hey, how come you're not allowed to eat from that tree? What did he say is going to happen? Oh, he says you'll die if you eat from that tree? No, that's not going to happen. He just doesn't want you to eat from it because then your eyes will be open and you'll understand reality and things like that. And he persuades her to eat from the forbidden tree, the forbidden fruit. And Eve then persuades her husband, Adam, to eat from it as well. So they've just broken the one rule. They've just disobeyed. And so as a result of that act of disobedience, there are consequences. As a result of this first sin, or as later theologians would come to describe it in the Middle Eastern traditions, original sin, all these consequences occur. They're expelled from the pristine garden. From a world of no suffering, they enter a world of hardship, which is the world that we live in. They become mortal. They're going to die. The Bible talks about that Adam came from dust, and to dust he'll return, right? Because he came from the earth. That Eve, when she gets pregnant, she'll experience extreme pain and discomfort. That's a consequence of what the Torah says occurred in the garden. And that serpent, the serpent is cursed to slither on his belly for the rest of his days and to have animosity between his descendants and the descendants of Adam and Eve. Now notice that I never describe that serpent as the devil or Satan. That's because in the Torah, it's not the devil. It's not Satan. There are 5 books in the Torah, and there's no being called Satan or the devil anywhere in those 5 books. The serpent in the Torah is just the serpent. Now, over the centuries, later Jewish thinkers and Christians and Muslims would all come to identify this serpent or snake with this being called Satan, the adversary. But Satan doesn't show up until after the Torah. He shows up in the other books of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job, the Ha-Satan, the adversary. But he's not in the Torah. There's other interesting things that aren't present in the Torah. For example, heaven and hell. Heaven and hell aren't in the Torah. Those ideas develop later. Right? They're there from the start once you get Christianity. They're there from the start once you get to Islam. In the Torah, the oldest Jewish text, is not there. There's reference to something called Sheol, which is this dark underworld, but everyone goes there. The good and the bad. The faithful and the wicked. So there's this real emphasis on the Torah on the importance of life, of living life and prospering in this life, not living for the next life. That emphasis on the afterlife comes later. It's not there from the start. So jumping forward, right? There's more to the story. You can read it. Jumping forward along the narrative, we've come to a time in which the descendants of Adam and Eve, living in this world of hardship, Adam and Eve have died. One of their sons murdered their other son. They had another, Seth. In time, humanity, the descendants of Adam and Eve, become very wicked. And so Elohim, Yahweh, decides, I think I need to start over. So he decides he's going to kill the whole human race. Start over. How's he going to start over? Flood. I'm going to kill all life on earth, on my creation, drown it all of the human beings, all the animals, all the insects, the birds, everything. Flood. But there's one exception. There's one righteous man amongst the wicked, and his name is Noah. And so Elohim, Yahweh, speaks to Noah and says, hey, you're the one righteous guy, so build a big boat, the ark, for you and your family. And then I want you also to collect pairs of animals, insects, animals, birds, all that. Because a big flood is coming, and everything that's not in your boat is going to die. So that's what Noah does. He builds his big boat. Here's a European painting of the ark built by Noah, and we see lines of animals. You need a very, very big boat for that. And then the flood comes, and everyone dies in the flood except Noah and his family. And so when the rains stop and the floodwaters recede and subside, everyone on this boat gets out, and they then repopulate the earth. So every human being, yes, is a descendant of Adam and Eve, according to the Torah. But after the flood, the only survivors are those who are descendants of Noah and his family. So everyone on earth now, according to the Torah, is a descendant of Noah and his family. Because every other human being died in the flood. And likewise, all the animals that exist are the descendants of the pairs that went on the ark. So thus far, these stories from the first book of the Torah have dealt with the whole of humanity. But it's at this point now that the Torah narrative is going to shift to focus specifically on the descendants of the ancient Israelites. Those Israelites who were defeated by the Pharaoh Merneptah in 1208 BCE, as recorded on the Stela of Merneptah. So turning now to the specific tribal ancestors of the Israelites, as a distinctive people from the other Canaanites, from everyone else, the Torah introduces us to this figure called Abram, who later becomes Abraham. And Abraham lives in a city called Ur. Now, there's some debate about where ancient Ur was located, but the prevailing view is that it was in Mesopotamia, which would make a lot of sense when you understand the relationship between Mesopotamia and the Israelites. And going by the Torah's chronology, Abraham would have lived somewhere around 1800 BCE. So Abraham is married. His wife is Sarai, later Sarah. And at the time, as I said, the emphasis on the Torah isn't on an afterlife. It's about life here and now. And so there's a real importance placed on having children, offspring, especially sons. and having land for your descendants to inhabit. So guess what? Abraham hears this call from this mysterious deity. It's Elohim, Yahweh, who tells him to take his wife, and they're both already advanced in age, they're in their 70s, and to travel to a land that I will show you. What's the land? It's the land of Canaan, the land that would become the kingdom of Judah, and before that, the kingdom of Israel. So he travels there and he settles there. It's already inhabited by the Canaanites. They're polytheists, but Abraham is a monotheist. And he's a man of true faith and obedience to his one God. And he establishes this relationship with his God, the God we know as Elohim or Yahweh or Hashem. And terms are laid out, terms of what we would come to know as the covenant. An agreement that would apply to Abraham and his descendants in the generations to come. So for his obedience and commitment to his God, Abraham is promised that he'll become the father of a great nation. In fact, the literal meaning of the name Abraham is father of nations. That's what his name means. Well, years pass, but his wife Sarai, who's, again, they're both old already. They haven't had any children. She's barren still. And so getting impatient and fearful that Abraham might die without ever having an heir, giving birth to a son, Sarai or Sarah says, here, take my slave girl, an Egyptian girl named Hagar, and you should sleep with her, lay with her, the biblical euphemism, and have a child with her so that you can have an heir, right, descendants. And Abraham agrees. The idea was that Hagar would act as a kind of proxy mother, and the child would, in effect, be the child of Sarah, but that's not how it worked out. So Hagar gets pregnant, gives birth to a son who is named Ishmael. So now Abraham has a son, but it wasn't through the miraculous means that he had been promised. And the relationship between Sarah and Hagar turns foul. Jealousy develops. Instead of Ishmael being Sarah's child, he's still very much Hagar's child, and she looks at her master, Sarah, with disdain, with disrespect. So it's at this time that the Torah says another rule is laid out in this agreement between Abraham and his God, that as a sign of this covenant, of this special relationship, Abraham and every male member of his household, including slaves, every member of his household has to be circumcised, which is to say, in case you aren't familiar with circumcision, that the foreskin of the penis has to be cut off. And so that's what's done. Abraham is circumcised. Ishmael is circumcised, and circumcision thereafter becomes the symbol of the covenant between the descendants of Abraham and Abraham's God. Or, as the story develops, between Yahweh and the Jewish people. And that still applies today, that circumcision is required for Jewish males as a sign of the covenant, the special agreement, the special relationship between Yahweh, or Elohim, Hashem, and the Jewish people. Well, it's at this point then that Abraham's God comes through, right? He had promised that Sarah would give birth, and sure enough, she does. She gets pregnant in her 90s and gives birth to a son named Isaac. And the name Isaac in its original Hebrew form means laughter, because Abraham and Sarah, there's two rival accounts actually in the Torah. They laugh when they hear the news that she's actually going to give birth because they think it's so preposterous because she's so old. So once Abraham has a son through his wife Sarah, Ishmael is no longer necessary. So Ishmael and his mother Hagar are cast out into the wilderness. And the Torah says that Hagar and Ishmael are in the wilderness and they're about to die of thirst off in the desert. And God makes a spring of water gush forth and they drink and they're able to survive. Now, the story of Hagar and Ishmael essentially ends there in the Torah. There's reference to Ishmael being at his father's funeral in the Torah, some other references to Ishmael's descendants, but his story stops there. All the attention is placed on this second son, the son of Sarah, Isaac. And so Isaac is the next important ancestor of the Israelites, or the Jews. And so we refer to these male ancestors as patriarchs. So first we have Abraham, then we have Isaac, and then we'll have a particular son of Isaac, Jacob. So the God of the Jews is often referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we'll get to Jacob in a moment. Now, later on in the semester, we're going to study Islam. And Muslims believe that the place where Ishmael and Hagar settled later became Mecca, the city of Mecca in Arabia. And there are various Muslim stories about Abraham going to visit Ishmael there, and that they built this shrine to the worship of the one God there, and that Ishmael is the great ancestor of the Arab tribes. And one of those descendants of Ishmael is a man named Muhammad, who was born in the late 6th century, and he's the prophet of Islam, the world's second largest religion. So we'll revisit the story of Ishmael when we study Islam, but for now, in Judaism, all the attention is placed on Isaac. So at this critical moment, Abraham's God decides to test him. And remember what I said at the start, that here, sin is about obedience or disobedience to God. It's not something being moral or immoral. And here's the case in point. Abraham's God commands him to take his beloved son Isaac and take him to the altar and kill him, to kill his own son as a sacrifice. So on the surface, a father murdering his child, that would be immoral. That would seem to be a pretty serious sin. But in this case, Abraham is obeying God and thus going through with this, which to the outsider, you think, gosh, this is crazy. This is horrible, a father murdering his son. No, it's not a sin here. In fact, it's the right thing to do. Abraham is obeying God, is obeying Yahweh. He passes the test. He takes his son, bounds him on the altar, and he draws the knife and he's about to cut his son's throat. And it's at that moment that the Torah says a messenger of Abraham's God, who we would call an angel in English, stops Abraham and says, "Stop, Abraham, you've obeyed, you've passed this test, you've demonstrated your obedience, you've demonstrated your faith. Now take that ram over there in the bushes and sacrifice that animal on the altar instead of your son." So Isaac is allowed to survive. Abraham passed the test. And what a test. So here we have a Renaissance era European Christian painting of this event. We have Abraham. There's Isaac on the altar, looking quite terrified. And Abraham he's got his knife here, he's about to kill Isaac. He's obeying God. Here's the angel stopping him. And then here you can see the ram that will be a substitute in place of Isaac. So after Abraham's death, this covenant, this special relationship between Abraham and his God passed to Isaac. And then from Isaac, it's going to pass to one of his sons. But Isaac has twin sons. And the first one to leave his mother's womb was Esau. And so technically he would have gotten it, but Jacob manages to trick his father, who doesn't see very well, according to the Torah, into getting the covenant. So the covenant passes to Jacob. Now, we get this very interesting story. It's a curious story about Jacob in the Torah, which provides us with the origin of the term Israel, which means God triumphs. a shortened form of Elohim or Eloah is El. So El, E-L in English, means God as well. And so you see in the word Israel that it ends with the word El. And so it means God or El triumphs. Just like in the name Ishmael, that ends with E-L as well, that means God hears. El hears. So the Torah says that one night while Jacob and his family are camped out, Jacob runs into this silent stranger in the darkness and ends up in a physical confrontation, wrestling this stranger. And they wrestle all night, and it's only when it's almost dawn that the stranger then wrenches Jacob's leg and defeats him. And then once the sun comes up, the stranger is gone. And it's because of that stranger's victory over Jacob that Jacob gets a new name, Israel. God triumphs, as in God defeated Jacob in this wrestling match. Now, what is the meaning of Jacob wrestling with God? Does that mean God is a man, God is a person? Well, for some Christians, they would see that as an identification of the idea of the incarnation. But in the Jewish tradition and in the Islamic tradition, the figure that Jacob wrestled with is an angel, right? One of these messengers of this transcendent one God, just like one of the messenger that stopped Abraham from sacrificing his son. So here you see some European paintings. On the left, we have a painting by the great Marc Chagall showing Jacob wrestling with an angel. And here's the passage from the Torah in the book of Genesis. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. And so that's where the Torah says this word Israel comes from. And Jacob goes on to have, according to the Torah, 12 sons. And those 12 sons then have wives and descendants as well. And they become the 12 tribes of Israel, or the Israelites. Yes, the Israelites that the Stela of Merneptah says were in Canaan in 1208 BCE. At least that's according to the Torah, which was written hundreds of years later. So once we have the Israelites, the Torah focuses on what happens to the Israelites. And in particular, it talks about the emergence of this great prophet, this great human messenger of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the great prophet Moses. And Moses is the greatest prophet in Judaism. He is the greatest prophet of the Torah. He is this culminating figure, the figure through whom God communicates the Torah. That's the traditional belief, that the text of the Torah itself is divine revelation communicated to the Jewish people through the great prophet Moses, who, again, going with the textual chronology, would have lived sometime around the 13th century BCE. The story of Moses begins with the Israelites not living in Canaan, but actually living in Egypt. And that they had become slaves there in bondage. And they had become very numerous. And because they had become so numerous, it says that the Pharaoh at the time, who is unnamed, the Pharaoh at the time decides to kill the infant boys of the Israelites. And as such, this Israelite family hides their infant son, who we would come to know as Moses, in a river. And it's in that river that, as luck would have it, the family of Pharaoh himself, his daughter, finds the baby Moses in a basket in the river. And not knowing who the child belongs to, she raises him and names him Moses. And the origin of the name Moses means to be drawn out, as in drawn out of the water. So he grows up being an Egyptian prince. That's why there's that animated movie here in the United States called The Prince of Egypt. And it's about the youth of Moses and when he becomes this prophet and the Exodus story. So Moses grows up thinking he's Egyptian, but he is, in fact, an Israelite. And once he discovers this as a young man, and also discovers that he has an older brother and an older sister, Aaron and Miriam, he gradually begins to accept his true identity. And one day he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave. And he intervenes, and in the process, he kills the Egyptian. And because Moses has murdered this Egyptian or committed manslaughter, Moses then has to flee. And so he escapes to the east, to the land of Midian, in the region of what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. And it's there that Moses, leaving his past behind, lives amongst this particular tribe. He gets married, he becomes a shepherd, and he has this profound encounter with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the wilderness, his encounter with the burning bush. So I'm all out of time there. I'll pick up with Moses next time, and we'll talk about the Exodus, the core central event of the Torah, and we'll continue our discussion of Jewish religious discourse and then moving forward with other aspects of Judaism. Thank you very much. See you next time.